In modern systems, comfort is not an emergent byproduct. It is a designed outcome. It is engineered, layered, optimized, and distributed with precision to produce stability, not pleasure, not care. What follows is not an argument for or against comfort. It is an examination of how it functions. These systems do not shape behavior through force. They do it through ease. Friction is identified as inefficiency, then removed across interfaces, services, logistics, and everyday decisions. Calm becomes the visible result. Dependency accumulates quietly beneath it. Comfort operates as a containment strategy. By narrowing behavior into predictable channels, it reduces volatility at scale. Autonomy is not removed but reclassified. It becomes a variable cost rather than a protected capacity, exercised only when efficiency permits. This exchange is never presented as a trade. It arrives as an upgrade. Each added layer of convenience reduces the need for judgment, delays exposure to consequence, and transfers responsibility outward into systems designed to absorb it. Relief is experienced locally. Predictability is captured centrally. Over time, the sustained absence of friction produces a specific condition. Skills decay without noticeable failure. Decision-making weakens without crisis. Agency remains intact in theory, but is used less and less in practice. Once this threshold is crossed, freedom does not disappear. It becomes impractical to exercise. The system continues to function smoothly, and resisting its defaults now carries a cost that exceeds the perceived benefit of doing so. Comfort scales by standardization. What can be predicted can be optimized, and what can be optimized can be managed at distance. Systems therefore favor behaviors that repeat cleanly, require minimal context, and produce measurable outputs without interruption. The mechanism is subtle and procedural. Interfaces narrow choice sets, defaults absorb hesitation, and automation resolves ambiguity before it becomes conscious. The individual experiences relief, while the system records stability. This relief is not neutral. When outcomes are pre-shaped, judgment becomes redundant. When correction is automated, error stops teaching. Over time, participation continues, but discernment weakens without registering as loss. The system does not remove alternatives outright. It preserves them formally, while making deviation inefficient. Each non-default path carries added friction, time cost, or exposure that the optimized path avoids. Eventually, behavior converges, not through coercion but through exhaustion. The path of least resistance becomes the path of least consequence, and agency begins to feel like an unnecessary expenditure. At this stage, calm is no longer a state. It is a requirement. Deviation introduces instability the system is not designed to accommodate, and instability is treated as a defect rather than a signal. The limit appears before the mechanism becomes visible. Beyond a certain level of comfort density, voluntary effort stops being economically viable, not impossible, simply inefficient relative to the system's baseline. What follows is structural, not psychological. When systems absorb risk, individuals stop pricing it accurately. When buffers are permanent, caution loses its calibration. The result is not recklessness, but misalignment between action and consequence. This misalignment compounds quietly. Decisions are made without feedback that would normally refine them. Errors are smoothed over before they register. Over time, competence erodes without any single moment of failure. The system benefits from this erosion. Lower variance simplifies forecasting. Narrower behavior bands reduce load. Predictability replaces capability as the primary asset. Freedom remains technically intact. Options exist, but exercising them now requires disproportionate effort, unsupported exposure, and tolerance for instability that the surrounding environment no longer trains. At this point, autonomy carries a penalty, not imposed by law or force, but by infrastructure calibrated around compliance with its own efficiencies. This is where the exchange becomes visible, though rarely acknowledged. Comfort is no longer experienced as benefit but as baseline. Its absence is felt as threat rather than loss of excess. Systems adapt to this shift by redefining stability. Calm is treated as proof of correctness. Disruption, even when informative, is categorized as noise. The system does not ask whether calm was earned, only whether it was maintained. At scale, this produces a narrow tolerance band. Human variability is smoothed out, not because it is harmful, but because it is inefficient. What cannot be standardized becomes externalized, delayed, or quietly excluded. There is a point at which the system stops being fully legible. Beyond this threshold, behavior is shaped by interactions no single designer controls, yet the outputs remain enforced through incentives embedded too deeply to challenge directly. From the outside, this looks like order. From within, it feels like low-grade containment. Not confinement, but a persistent narrowing of acceptable motion that never announces itself as restriction. After this stage, recovery of unused capacity is no longer automatic. The conditions that once developed judgment, tolerance, and independent calibration are absent, and their absence does not trigger alarms. At this stage, the system no longer needs persuasion. Participation is sustained by habit, and habit requires no explanation. The individual continues to operate inside boundaries that feel natural precisely because they were never marked. Comfort now functions as insulation. It dampens signal strength. Warnings arrive late, softened, or abstracted into metrics that describe performance without conveying exposure. The system remains calm even as underlying capacity thins. This is not a dramatic collapse. It is a condition, a stable surface over diminishing depth. Output continues, services remain available, and life appears uninterrupted while optionality contracts beneath routine. Dependency follows predictability. When systems reliably absorb friction, self-correction becomes unnecessary. When correction becomes unnecessary, readiness dissolves without resistance. What is lost is not control, but the ability to operate without scaffolding. There is no moment where this is reversed by awareness alone. The infrastructure that removed strain also removed rehearsal for strain. When pressure returns, it arrives to an untrained surface. Beyond this point, improvement is no longer a meaningful category. The remaining movement is administrative. Adjustments occur, but only within parameters the system already recognizes. What falls outside those parameters is deferred, externalized, or written off as anomaly. Here, responsibility becomes diffuse. No single actor enforces the constraint, yet deviation is consistently penalized. Costs appear as delays, access loss, or silent exclusion rather than direct refusal. The system presents this as neutrality. It responds the same way to all inputs, provided those inputs remain legible. What is illegible is not confronted. It is simply unsupported. Over time, behavior adapts to avoid these edges, not consciously, through repetition. The range of action contracts further, not because options vanish, but because engaging them reliably produces friction with no compensating return. At this level, freedom persists only as a formal property. It exists in principle, but not in practice. Exercising it requires tolerating instability without institutional buffering. The system does not prevent this. It merely declines to assist. What remains is not collapse and not resolution. The system continues, refined and calm, operating within the limits it optimized for. Stability is maintained, and maintenance becomes the primary objective. Freedom in this context is no longer opposed. It is simply irrelevant. The system neither suppresses nor supports it, because its functioning does not depend on individual discretion. What does not contribute to predictability is treated as excess. This produces a final asymmetry. Comfort is cumulative and reinforced. Autonomy is optional and untrained. The imbalance does not announce itself as loss, only as narrowing. At the edge of this structure, some capacities still exist: judgment without prompts, action without buffering, endurance without insulation. They are not rewarded and they are not prohibited. They are merely unsupported and therefore costly to maintain.